Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be talking about our favorite book, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson. Today, going over Chapter 5, You Are Always Choosing. What are you always choosing? Well, to quote something from the earlier part of the book, you are always choosing what to care about. And you only have so many, as Mark likes to put it, you only have so many fucks to give, so you better really only give a fuck about a couple things. We're going to talk about much more in this chapter. Last time, chapter 4, we talked about the value of suffering and how that there are good values and bad values that you can live your life by. Good values tend to be, I'm going to butcher this a little bit, but they're very internal. They're things that are very actionable and that you yourself have an effect over. Whereas bad values tend to be stuff on the external outside of you that you really don't have much control of. So the fact that, for example, if you think being popular is a good value, if you think being rich is a good value, well, yeah, you can control that to an extent, but in a lot of ways, other people are going to determine how popular you are, right? And you could think that you're rich, but other people could easily make more money than you. So in the grand scheme of things, even if you have hundreds and thousands of dollars, but if everybody else has way more, then are you really rich? See, those are not the greatest values. And another property of a good value is that they are reality-based as well. So anyway, that was last time. Good chapter. Today, talking about Chapter 5, You Are Always Choosing. Let's go to the first slide. So there's this scenario that Mark opens up the chapter with, and in one of the scenarios, you have a gun to your head. Some guy says, hey, I'm going to do something bad to you unless you run 26.2 miles in 5 hours. So it sounds like you're running a marathon. That would suck, right? That'd be a terrifying situation. But let's take another situation where you're training, you have a ton of family support, you set a goal, you plan on this months out. So you slowly train up to running 26.2 miles. And it goes great. So when you choose to run the 26.2 miles freely, it's a huge moment in your life. But when you're forced to do it, it becomes a truly horrible situation. But it's the same 26.2 miles. And Mark writes here, often the only difference between a problem being painful or being powerful is a sense that we chose it and that we are responsible for it. Like I wrote there in that third bullet point. So the choice. What is the choice? Well, a little bit of another anecdote here is this gentleman, William James. So William James had a lot of problems. So this was this gentleman born into a wealthy, prominent family, and from birth, he suffers a lot of health issues. He's got a vomiting problem. That would be awful. That's worse than the eye problem. I don't know, in my opinion. Oh, geez, that would suck. Yeah, he's got a lot of health issues. William James has this brother, Henry James, who goes on to be a novelist. And I don't think this is the Henry James that you're thinking of, or actually maybe it might be. His younger brother, Henry James, went on to become a world-renowned novelist. Okay, so maybe it is that Henry James. So William James, so far, not as successful as his brother, and I think his parents were getting kind of disappointed. They wanted him to get into something that he could succeed at, so his father gets him into Harvard Medical School, pulls some strings, gets him in there. Well, William James doesn't really like it, and he ends up dropping out. Instead, he chooses to take a trip to the Amazon, which is, you're talking about 1860s, so it's a long time ago. This is way different than just flying down there. Probably had to, take a ship, take a ship, railroad, much difficult travel back then than today. So he goes down there, and then he almost dies when he's down there. He comes back home, and when he comes back home, he starts to read this guy, and this is what Mark writes. One night, while reading lectures by philosopher Charles Peirce, James decided to conduct a little experiment. In his diary, he would spend 1 year believing that he was 100% responsible for everything that occurred in his life, no matter what. During this period, he would do everything in his power to change his circumstances, no matter the likelihood of failure. If nothing improved that year, then it would be apparent that he was truly powerless to the circumstances around him. Lo and behold, Father of American Psychology, goes on to teach at Harvard, tours around the U.S. and Europe giving lectures, later starts a family, and the rest is kind of history. So what's the meaning of William James's story? So the meaning that Mark says is we choose how to interpret our lives. We choose how to look at our lives, how to look at those 26.2 miles. And we choose how responsible we are for certain things happening. Even we choose how to interpret the meaning of an event. Even not choosing to interpret is still an interpretation, Mark writes. So it's like I said at the beginning, what do we choose to care about? And are those good things to care about? Similar to the last chapter. What values are we going to live by? And are those actually good values in and of themselves? So this was a pretty cool section of the book where Mark outlines this responsibility fault fallacy. Two different things. And I think maybe in the past I equated these two things as being similar, but they're not really similar. So there's this famous quote from Spider-Man, the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. Now there's been like 10 Spider-Mans. Slight exaggeration, but you know what I mean. There's a lot. Tobey Maguire is my favorite, though. Oh, yeah, way back in the day. Uncle Ben, when he's sitting in the car, he drops him off somewhere. He's giving him kind of a little talk, and Peter's not having it. He tells Peter, with great power comes great responsibility. Mark flips this a little bit, and he says also, with great responsibility comes great power. And I think I would tend to agree with that, because the more responsible you are for your life, it gives you more power and control over your life so that you can enact changes that then move your life in a positive direction. It's like they say in AA, the first step is just admitting you have a problem. I mean, in this situation, the first step to solving problems, admit that you have the problems and accept responsibility for them. Because then you're on the track of trying to change your situation. But if you're not responsible for your problems, then you're not going to change anything, because even if you do anything, it's not going to make a difference. You see what I'm saying there? So he tells this story of, okay, so there's this guy, he's down on himself. He's not tall enough to date women, and he thinks that this is an issue. Well, this is not a very healthy way to look at it. It's very disempowering, because it's something that you don't really have much control of. In this case, your genetics. You don't really have much control over that, on how tall you're going to become. So you have no choice in that matter, but you can frame it in a different way and instead choose to highlight the positive aspects of yourself. And not saying that height is, something. There's good people who are short and tall and what have you, but instead choose to, like we talked about in the last chapter, choose values and choose a perspective that is actionable, reality-based, and that you have direct effect over. So, okay, yeah, you're not tall enough to date women, but you have a great personality, you're funny, you're strong and fit, you are what have you. You make a lot of money, what have you. It's choosing to frame it in a different way. And that is part of what it means when Mark says the responsibility and fault fallacy. Somebody drops a baby off at your front doorstep. It's not your fault that the baby's there. It's somebody else's fault. They did it. But now that baby is your responsibility, whether you like it or not. And Mark says here that fault is a past tense thing. Fault results from choices that have already been made. But responsibility is a present tense thing. And I'll even add here that it's like a future tense thing. It's something that you are directly dictating right now in the moment. For a given time in the future, you will be responsible for something. You and the choices that you make right now are going to be the fault in the future for somebody else. Maybe that's a confusing way to put it. But I kind of like the bullet point that I wrote there. It results from choices you are currently making. So that the choices you make now, they will be your fault because you're actually doing them. But fault in this situation is something that has already happened that you didn't have necessarily had control over in this baby example. So many people could be at fault for your situation. You could be at fault for your situation. But nobody's going to, I shouldn't say nobody. You should be the one to take responsibility for the future of your situation, for the present and the future of your situation. That's the best way to think about this, I think. Fault, past tense. Responsibility, present, and I'm adding the future thing. That's kind of something that I just kind of thought about that kind of makes sense. To me, you're doing actions in the present time, but also for an indefinite amount of time in the future. So many people could be at fault, but you're the only one who is responsible. And that's the important thing here, is knowing your role and what transpires in the situation. And, oh yeah, pain is inevitable. This is something that I think I lose sight of, is that in jiu-jitsu, let's say, where I oftentimes think that everything should look clean. Like a move that I do should be clean, super clean. If I don't have the correct alignment on an arm bar, I'm not super tight in on it, then I'm not going to finish it. And I just let it go. But that's not how jiu-jitsu works. It's going to be messy and it's not going to be perfect, but it doesn't mean that you can't finish things. And it's kind of the same thing in this situation. Pain is inevitable. Nothing's ever going to be perfect, right? You're always going to suffer losses. And I guess to further my jiu-jitsu point, the pain and the losses and getting tapped out in jiu-jitsu, that's inevitable. But we choose how that defines us. Do we see ourselves as a failure from getting submitted 4 or 5 times in a training session? Or do we say, okay, that's a learning experience? Because it's inevitable. Everybody's going to get tapped out. Everybody. But how do you choose to view that and move on from it? So Mark highlights the story of Malala Yousafzai, who was a young woman who starts speaking out against this ban on women from attending school in Pakistan, this area that I believe he was saying the Taliban had taken over. And they changed a lot of things, and they basically banned women from going out in public, I believe it was, and even banned them from attending schools. Well, Malala speaks out against it, and she ends up getting shot in the head by some people, by the Taliban. And she survives, and she's good for her. She still speaks out against it. She somehow survived that situation. I'm trying to find the story here because it was a very, very powerful story. Oh, yeah, here it is. Okay. Today, she's still alive. 2014, she received a Nobel Peace Prize. Whew. It would have been easy for her to lie down and say, I can't do anything or I have no choice. That, ironically, would have still been her choice, but she chose to do the opposite. So how does she respond to the tragedy? It's not her fault that happened to her, but goddamn, she took responsibility and she moved forward. She survived and she chose to still speak out against it. And that's what an amazing story. Genetics and the hand that we're dealt. So in this next section, Mark brings up this one story that was done in the BBC, 2013. They rounded up some teenagers with obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. They followed them around. A lot of the teens had debilitating OCD. They couldn't do certain things. They had to do things in a certain way. Some were superbly germophobic. Other people, they had to do things one body limb at a time. Yeah, very debilitating. And ultimately, the things that they do are not rational, but they value them. That's why they keep doing them. And what ends up happening is this just ends up causing way more pain. And how they kind of give these teens a path out of this, how they can take responsibility to get a path out of this, is not seeing this as, okay, this is somebody else's fault. I have no control over it. Okay, OCD is not your fault, but it's now your responsibility. So they kind of tell these teens, okay, the values that you have right now are your disorder's values. They're not yours. Doing the crazy tics that you do and the activities that you do, you're doing them for the disorder, not for yourself. So let's choose a value that's more important than the OCD so that you would rather do things for that value and not for the OCD itself. Like Mark says, you didn't choose the condition, but you choose how you live with it. And something I said earlier, your genetics are not your fault, but they are your responsibility. So they do, in the end, they do kind of get the teens to make some other choices. So for some of the kids, the possibility of not having to hide his disorder from his friends and family all the time, the prospect of having a normal functioning social life. For another person, it's the idea of taking control over her own thoughts and feelings and being happy again. For another, it's the ability to leave the house for long periods of time without suffering traumatic episodes. So you focus on those values and you'll be able to manage that OCD. You'll have something to work towards. It's not something that, and Mark points this out, it's not something that's curable, but you can learn to live with it and live a better life. Live a life that's more attached to positive values and not values that are tied to the disorder itself, feeding the disorder, if you will. Mark later, he makes this analogy that life is kind of like poker. And he mentions how in poker, a lot of times you can have the best cards but still lose the pot, like the amount of money in the middle of that particular hand. Because it's about the choices you make in the betting cycle, if you're playing like Texas Hold'em. I'm not an expert at this, but life is like that too. Yes, people are dealt shitty hands as far as genetics-wise. You're too short, you're too skinny, too fat, what have you, but in the end, you can make choices that are aligned to positive values that can get you out, maybe not get you out, but you can learn to live with in certain situations. You can change certain things up to a point. And maybe it might not be perfect. Maybe you might not fully solve an issue, but you become way better off when you accept the issues and you take responsibility for them and not see them as, oh, this is not my fault. It's not your fault, but it's your responsibility. And this is kind of the most popular thing to do right now, is this victimhood mentality, this victimhood chic, as Mark calls it. So you just pass your problems on to other people, and you share in the conglomerate of injustices in the world, and you share them with people, and all of a sudden other people share them with you, and you start to bond over the injustices that are done with you, and you see the injustices as the value in and of itself. It becomes cool to have bad stuff done to you, and you not do anything to mitigate it or do anything back. This is kind of called outrage porn, another word for it. So when the news reports on something offensive, it generates outrage, and then the news broadcasts the outrage back across the masses, and people go crazy, more so for the outrage that's being caused and not for the actual thing that was offensive. Not nearly as much. Well, victimhood chic is not a great way to live your life. And I'm not saying that there's not situations where there are victims in certain things, but again, you might not be at fault for certain situations, but it is your responsibility for what you do after that. And I get it. There's a lot of shitty situations out there. I get that. But it's kind of like the separate note, going back to the PowerPoint, the boy who cries wolf. If you just cry injustice all the time, well, maybe other people don't see it as injustice, but you keep crying out that something bad is happening to you. Other people might not look at it that way. And then by the time something actually bad happens to you, nobody's really listening to you. Falls on deaf ears. The signal becomes weaker over time, and people won't really take you as seriously. So you just got to remember, you are always choosing. You are always choosing what to care about. You're choosing the values. You're always choosing whether you live by positive values or negative values. And some things might not be your fault, but they are your responsibility. And there are side effects when you start to take responsibility for things. And this reminds me of a quote. And I used to work for the college that I went to, the football team. And there was a quote on one of the back of the t-shirts that said, you pay a price for jumping higher, you pay a price for running faster, you pay a price for getting stronger, you pay a price for staying the same. And it's kind of linked to the book in that you're never going to not have problems. You're just trading in problems for other problems. And you might think like, oh, you pay a price for you pay a price for getting faster. Well, that sounds like you're not paying a price for it. It's kind of like Marlowe says in The Wire, that sounds like one of them good problems. Well, yeah. All of a sudden, you become faster. Maybe by virtue of getting faster, you had to shed a little bit of weight. So all of a sudden, if we're talking from an athletic standpoint, you can't just run over people now. Or maybe now that you're faster, the coach has you running more go routes, like in football, running more down the field routes versus just little slants and ins, because now you're a little bit faster. So you did pay a price for getting faster. But is it a price is that seen as a negative thing? Well, not necessarily. So it's the same thing here. When you choose to take responsibility for your life, you might freak out. You might feel super nervous when you do this. You might feel like a failure. You might lose relationships. You might start to question yourself. Oh my gosh, am I doing the right thing here? You might feel nervous like, oh gosh, I'm choosing to accept responsibility for this, for that baby that showed on my doorstep. I have no clue what to do. I'm not even a father. You might get nervous, but the nervousness is probably a good thing, showing that you care about the situation. You might freak out. Oh my gosh, this baby just showed up on my doorstep. Well, yeah, I'd freak out too. I'd freak out too. You might start to question yourself. Am I ready for this? How am I ready for taking responsibility for this baby and trying to find its home? What do I do? Do I call the authorities, etc.? You might feel like a failure because all this time you were using a different metric system on how to measure your success. And then this baby shows up and you're like, gosh, I don't even know what metric system would go with this. So how can you measure your success? You're going to see yourself as a failure. I know I'm using the baby example because Mark used it in the book, but this ties into multiple different things. And that, my friends, is the conclusion of Chapter 5. You are always choosing. Thank you so much for listening. Go check out the Chee-Tash podcast. Got great interviews on there with some great guests. Learned a lot talking to some of these guests. Currently, I am interviewing Russell DeRay about... Well, I already interviewed him, but the episodes are coming out from that interview on his book, They Put America in the Air. Really cool deep dive into the aircraft and airline and flight industry in America. Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll be back next time, Chapter 6. Thank you so much. My name is Chris. This is Chee-Tash. Take care.